lift off and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February 26, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Michael Abdillah, and tonight I'm joined by Tina Stagg, and we are both from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get started with some Australian space news. Queensland is heating up the local space race with an $8 million investment plan. The Queensland Government has launched an $8 million investment strategy in a quest to create up to 6,000 high-value space industry jobs and contribute $3.5 to $6 billion to the state's economy by 2036. Queensland's burgeoning space industry currently supports more than 2,000 full-time jobs and generates $760 million in annual revenue, with another $500 million in value added to downstream industries, such as Earth observation. The state is also home to several key research and development organisations supporting the space industry, including the University of Queensland, Queensland University of Technology, the CSIRO, University of Southern Queensland, and Griffith University. The new investment strategy will leverage these strengths to bolster Queensland's space industry capability and help the industry tap into international markets. State Development Minister Cameron Dick said the government was keen to support the development of common user infrastructure such as orbital launch and static rocket testing facilities, satellite ground stations and a data analytics hub promoting skills and career pathways, and assisting businesses in accessing supply chain opportunities and federal programs. And in other Australian news, Australia is opening a space robotics centre with an eye toward working with NASA on lunar exploration. The Australian Remote Operations for Space and Earth Centre in Perth will work to adapt technologies from remote mining operations in Australia for use in space. The centre has funding support from the West Australian Government as well as universities and several companies. And turning to New Zealand news, with a new player, Dawn Aerospace. Dawn Aerospace is putting the call out to designers, universities, scientists and space enthusiasts to enter a worldwide competition to paint their Mark II suborbital spaceplane. The company, based in New Zealand and the Netherlands, wants to build the first vehicle to fly to space and back twice in one day. The winning individual or team will be awarded a free payload slot on board the Mark II spaceplane, valued at $50,000. The vehicle will be launched from New Zealand's South Island, flying to an altitude of more than 100 kilometres. Designed to fly to space multiple times a day, the Mark II can fly out of any airport with a 900-metre sealed runway. The first flight of the spaceplane is scheduled for mid-2020. And that sounds like one to look out for. Over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Mike, and good evening, space fans. Turning to the United States, and in space policy news, the White House and NASA say the 2021 budget proposal for the agency has bipartisan support despite criticism of proposed cuts to some programs. Vice President Mike Pence, speaking last week at NASA's Langley Research Centre, said support for NASA and its $25.2 billion budget proposal for fiscal year 2021 was strong and broad and truly bipartisan. NASA Deputy Administrator Jim Morhard offered a similar view in a separate speech in Washington, saying the budget should give everyone full confidence that we're moving forward to the moon. Neither directly addressed proposed cuts to education, earth science and other programs in the budget request. And in International Space Station news, Russian space agency Roscosmos is replacing its cosmonauts on the next mission to the ISS. Anatoly Ivanishin and Ivan Wagner will replace Nikolai Tikhonov and Andrei Babkin on the Soyuz mission launching in early April. Roscosmos said the swap was because of medical reasons, and Russian sources reported that Tikhonov suffered an injury during training. NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy, the third member of the Soyuz crew, will remain on the mission. And to NASA and the agency's Commercial Crew program, NASA confirmed that SpaceX will soon become the first private company in history to launch astronauts to the International Space Station, in a tweet that was later deleted. The Commercial Crew account has since deleted its tweet, and NASA's accompanying blog post, linked in the tweet, was changed to reflect a different interpretation. But the original text stated that the SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft, assigned to the first crew launch from American soil since 2011, has arrived at the launch site. Given that both the tweet and blog post contained the same phrase, the fact that NASA retroactively changed the blog post suggests that SpaceX will, in fact, become the first private company in history to launch astronauts into orbit. It is believed that all the hardware needed for SpaceX's Demo 2 astronaut launch debut, Falcon 9 booster B1058, a Falcon 9 upper stage, Crew Dragon capsule C206, and a Crew Dragon trunk, is finished, acceptance tested, and preparing for flight at Cape Canaveral in Florida. And to NASA's Space Launch System, and the SLS's debut has slipped to April next year. No surprise to most commentators. Preparations continue at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida for the first launch of the SLS, the gigantic rocket NASA hopes to use to launch humans to the lunar surface and to the commercial rocket-constructed Lunar Gateway. But while KSC prepares for the rocket's arrival and first mission, various NASA centres are now actively planning for a launch no earlier than April 18, 2021. KSC teams are continuing to work through launch simulations for the SLS. And to NASA's planetary and space science programs, and the agency's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, or MRO, is offline until the end of the month to perform a memory update. The orbiter started a 2-week hiatus early last week so engineers could update battery parameters in the spacecraft's flash memory, which will ensure the spacecraft's batteries are properly charged. Controllers are making other updates to the spacecraft's memory during the hiatus. MRO has been orbiting Mars for nearly 14 years, and with this update should be able to continue operations well into this decade. And to the US Space Force, the Space Force has requested a study on the capabilities of the commercial space industry. The RAND Corporation is carrying out the 1-year study requested last October to identify commercial space technologies the Space Force could put to use, as well as the potential risks of employing commercial systems during an armed conflict. And to the US's Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. DARPA is allowing the sole remaining competitor in its responsive launch competition to perform both launches from the same spaceport. The DARPA Launch Challenge originally required competitors to perform 2 launches from 2 different sites, both revealed on short notice, in order to win as much as $12 million. At a media briefing last week, DARPA said Astra, the only company still in the competition, would be able to conduct both launches from the Pacific Spaceport Complex, Alaska, on Kodiak Island, although from 2 different pads about 300 metres apart. Astra planned to perform that first launch no earlier than February 25, in a window that runs through to March the 1st. If that launch is successful, it would attempt a second launch between March 18 and March the 31st. But Astra CEO Chris Kemp said it might take a few attempts for the company to reach orbit and was setting expectations accordingly. Back to Michael.
Thank you, Tina. And turning to Russian news. The head of Roscosmos says he will meet with NASA to discuss Russian participation in NASA's exploration plans. Dmitry Rogozin said he would meet with NASA officials before the launch of the next crewed Soyuz spacecraft in April to speak about cooperation in deep space exploration. Such discussions are expected to include any role for Russia in the Lunar Gateway or other aspects of NASA's Moon to Mars strategy. Turning to China. China has resumed launches after a break caused by the Chinese New Year and exacerbated by the coronavirus outbreak. A Long March 2D rocket lifted off from the Zhaishang Satellite Launch Center last week and placed 4 technology test satellites into orbit. The satellites will test new Earth observation technology and inter-satellite networking. Meanwhile, China's Chang'e 4 lunar lander has reached its 15th lunar day. The lander and its Yutu-2 rover woke up early last week after hibernating through the 2-week lunar night, as the 2 spacecraft have done since landing early last year. The rover has travelled 367 metres across the lunar surface. And as mentioned earlier, China's space industry is suffering adverse effects from the coronavirus outbreak in the country. Restrictions on travel mean many employees cannot return to places of work, including facilities for China's major space contractors. X-Space, a launch service provider for solid propellant rockets, has temporarily stopped work because of its proximity to the epicentre of the outbreak in Wuhan. The effects on other companies are more difficult to gauge and may only become apparent much later, given the long lead time for missions. And in Japanese news, a Japanese Mars mission has won approval for further development. The Japanese space agency JAXA said the government gave formal approval to proceed with the Martian Moon Exploration, or MMX, mission for launch in 2024. MMX will go to the Martian moon Phobos and collect samples for return to Earth. The mission will include an instrument called MAGAIN, provided by NASA. And turning to commercial news and SpaceX. SpaceX's first Starship test flight is drawing closer as the rocket's nose cone nears completion. SpaceX CEO Elon Musk posted a new glimpse inside SpaceX's South Texas Starship factory last week, revealing a nearly completed rocket nose cone and indicating that the first upgraded Starship prototype's flight debut is imminent. SpaceX teams have been working around the clock for more than a month to build the first full-scale, flight-worthy Starship prototype, a process that only began after 2 test tanks were fabricated, assembled, and pressurized until they burst on January 10 and 28. The test results allowed SpaceX to confirm that the company was ready to manufacture orbital-class and human-rated Starships. And the Port of Los Angeles has approved a new lease agreement with SpaceX. The lease agreement covers the same property SpaceX originally planned to use for a new launch vehicle factory in 2018, only for SpaceX to pull out of the project a little more than a year ago. The revised agreement emphasises the adaptive reuse of existing structures on the property rather than the construction of a new factory there. SpaceX projects up to 130 aerospace jobs will be created, although the company has not discussed its specific plans for the site. And back to you, Tina.
Thanks, Mike. And in more commercial space news, Blue Origin has formally opened the Alabama factory where it will produce rocket engines. The Huntsville factory, which cost more than $200 million to build, will be used to produce BE-4 engines for the company's New Glenn rocket and United Launch Alliance's Vulcan rocket, and the BE3U engine for New Glen's upper stage. The factory will start building engines in the northern summer, and Blue Origin will gradually transition engine productions from its current facility near Seattle to Huntsville in the next 2 to 3 years. The new factory will ultimately be able to build 42 engines a year. And some exciting news from Space Adventures. The company has announced an agreement with SpaceX for a dedicated Crew Dragon space tourist flight to an altitude above the International Space Station. The company said it would fly 4 tourists on a Crew Dragon mission launching between late 2021 and the middle of 2022. The mission would last for up to 5 days and go to an altitude at least twice as high as the station to provide a different view of the Earth. The company did not disclose pricing for the mission, but said ticket prices would be in the same range as other orbital spaceflight opportunities. And back to Mike.
Thank you, Tina. And finally tonight, astronomers recently announced a new effort in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. The SETI Institute announced a new partnership with the US National Radio Astronomy Observatory to use its Very Large Array radio telescope in New Mexico. The Institute's research program will piggyback on existing observations by the telescope to scan the skies for any signals from distant civilizations. Separately, the Breakthrough Listen initiative released data collected from other SETI searches, making it available for researchers to analyse. Its own analysis of the data turned up no evidence of signals from other worlds. And that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Tina, and we will speak to you again next week. Good night.